The BNZ art collection covers a compelling breadth and depth of New Zealand's artistic output up to the 1980s. Of course, it includes works by established and renowned artists of the time, heavyweights in the story of New Zealand art. Though the collection also included works from young and emerging artists of the day. On account of this, BNZ amassed a collection of historical weight, but it also fostered the careers of young artists at the time.
I think the BNZ collection was certainly on the radar of a lot of contemporary artists, and they wanted to be in the Bank of New Zealand collection. First of all, they wanted to be in Peter McLeavy's stable. Julian Dashper, John Reynolds were showing with them, and they wanted to be in those important corporate collections.
Getting your work collected by the Auckland City Gallery or National or Te Papa or whatever, these things signified a certain value of your work. I don't mean in monetary terms, but an appreciation of the work's value. So in that sense, these collections became important ways of helping validate artists in a culture which didn't give them a lot of validation most of the time.
For an artist to be included in the BNZ collection was a coup. It was regarded as an achievement. If Peter McLeavy chose your work for the BNZ collection, that was a feather in your cap.
In the 1980s, artists had sort of a new opportunity to practice their art, full time. They didn't have to rely on, side hustles for income because they were getting that income from their galleries.
What that means for art from that time is that it was really starting to blossom and diversify. Earlier generations of artists really had to have something else to support themselves, so a lot of them worked as teachers or they had office jobs.
People like Toss Williston, when he was in the West Coast, he had to work as a full-time Rawleys salesman selling healthcare products to sustain his living, and then he had to sort of find spare time to capture the landscape around him.
Alongside the contemporary works, throughout the 1980s, the collection also grew to represent earlier developments in New Zealand art.
Toll I think is a remarkable painter and is gradually developing a reputation and a place in the market, so to speak. I think he's a painter which is overdue for some sort of a survey, because I'm sure not very many people are familiar with his work.
What I really appreciate about the collection is the representation of plenty of New Zealand's most talented women artists. Figures like Evelyn Page, Rita Angus, Robin White, Fiona Partington, Gretchen Albrecht, the list really does go on, and it's great to see their recognition not only today but also way back in the 1980s.
Evelyn Page's career spanned 7 decades. She worked as a professional artist, which was rare for a woman of her time. Mostly her income came from selling portraits of people and landscape works, and that funded the works where she was being a bit more experimental.
The work behind me, Water Series by Louise Henderson, is a great example of her work in the 1960s. She was dealing with the death of her husband and moving away from the Cubist style that had largely dominated her work.
Peter McLeavy explained his desire to explore the bank's historical roots, reflected in the acquisition of mid-late 19th century paintings of the New Zealand landscape by Nicholas Chevalier and Charles Blomfield. Though these paintings differ visually and contextually from the majority of the collection, they represent the dawn of New Zealand art history. Altogether, the BNZ art collection covers a wide range of significant artists. Many of the works were hand-picked by McLeavy as prime examples, capturing the best of the collected artists' output.
So for a long time, McLeavy had represented the artist Robin White. Even when she went to Kiribati, he was tremendously supportive of the change in direction for her. And, he wrote to her obviously about the importance of her work and how its time would come. Soon the tide will turn, he said. But the work that he purchased for the BNZ art collection, in fact, is one of what he would call an icon of place. So it's a rural view of one of her friends stood in front of a railway goods shed, and it's a very typical Robin White, something that people would instantly recognise and relate to as being very much part of New Zealand culture and in fact part of the New Zealand vernacular.
There's this classic postmodern work in the collection called Russian Cruise Ship Princess Wharf. It's from 1987, and Dash started off by making this painting of kind of enlarged smither pebbles, from a classic smither painting, and then over the top of it he painted this geometric abstraction and this kind of one idea with another idea blotting it out.
There is a fantastic Milan Mirkosic painting in there, golden centre with two elements. It is one of his best paintings. I think it's reasonable to say that. One of the things that really stands out to me about the strength of this work is that it has both that precision and that kind of expressive kind of quality to it.
We recognise all the big names like Wollaston and McCann and Claremont and Fomerson and so on, but there are quite idiosyncratic little moments in the collection as well. I think he's got a very beautiful eye, McLeavy, and he chose a really fantastic Helen Stewart work, sort of rural scene, and there's delightful works by Hariata Ropata Tangaho, and he was very supportive of women artists.
It's not just the expected names, Of course the expected names are there, and there are great examples of their work, the Hoteries and the Hanleys. But to have a sprinkling of lesser-known figures gives a kind of distinctiveness and idiosyncrasy to the collection, which I think is a really valuable part of it.
Works from the collection have featured in landmark exhibitions, speaking to their significance to New Zealand art history.
The Bank of New Zealand has always been amazingly generous about loaning its work, so it's had big exhibitions of the collection at City Gallery and so on. So it really was important for artists to make their way into these public collections and to have their work seen.
There's a lot of collections that get put together as what I call all sorts collections, like Licorice All Sorts. They're not so much collections of art, they're collections of names, and the BNZ collection wasn't a collection of names, it was a collection of work. And that's a big difference, it's a fundamental difference, and it's something that a lot of people who regard themselves as collectors today perhaps could just stop and think about a little bit. Don't collect names, collect works.